Okay, so here's our presentation on minority influence. To start, what is minority influence? It is a fascinating concept in social psychology, and it's basically when a minority influences the majority, which is typically not how it works. So we kind of learn in class how through like conformity, the majority will oftentimes influence the minority to do things through like normative social influence. However, minority influence is typically reliant on informational social influence, because typically when people conform to the minority, it's not because they're trying to fit in, it's because they've actually thought about the argument, which often leads to then private acceptance and not public acceptance. A big factor when it comes to minority influence is consistency. So basically, they have to be consistent within their members, so every member has to believe the same things, and they also have to be consistent over time for their argument to be taken seriously and for people to actually consider conforming to the minority. And then one of the examples is 12 Angry Jurors. So in that show, there are 12 jurors, and 11 of them believe that the defendant is guilty, and one of them believes that they're innocent. And throughout the entirety of the show, you see how they all conform to the minority. So can the minority influence the majority? Moscovici did studies about this. He believed that the minority could influence the majority. And basically, he did an Ash-like conformity study that was a color perception test, where there were participants, and 6 of them were in a group. 2 of them were Confederates, and basically he proved how important that like consistency is in order to have people conform to the minority. So they were shown 36 slides that were all the color blue, and then they had to decide whether it was blue or green. But all of them were blue, and in one study, the 2 Confederates said that 12 of the slides were green and the rest of them were blue. So that was the inconsistent minority. And then in another one, all of them, or both of the Confederates, said that all of them were green, even though they were blue. So when they were consistent, a lot more people conformed. 8.2% out of all of those slides that people agreed that the slides were green instead of blue. When they were inconsistent, then it was more like 1.25%. Throughout the whole thing, about 32% of participants conformed to the incorrect minority. So that kind of just shows that the minority can be powerful. And then also rigid versus negotiating. There's a lot of different factors that can make people converge to the minority. First of all, if they're rigid or negotiating, if they're like very tight on their views and they won't compromise, then less people will conform. If they're a little bit more negotiating and are looking for a compromise, then they will. If the size of the minority increases, so does the perceived competence. And then also, as more people go from the majority to the minority, it becomes easier for people to conform. And then majority and minority influences. People debate whether that's a single process from which you conform from minority to majority and majority to minority, and some say it's 2. For the single process model, which is probably the more common one, basically just relies on Lataine's social impact theory, which says that social influence processes are the result of the interaction between the strength, immediacy, and number of influence sources. So whether it's going from minority to majority or the other way around, it just depends on the strength, the immediacy, and number of influence sources. An example of that is like a light bulb. So strength, how many watts, immediacy, how close it is to a wall, and number of influence sources, how many light bulbs. And depending on that, it will affect how strong the influence is.
So different from the one process model, we have the 2 process model, which says that minority influence operates by making people think about the position of the minority and look at all the possible outcomes. This causes them to really evaluate all the view of the minority. This is known as divergent thinking. The outcome is that the majority begin to adopt the minority's views because they were converted to their position. This leads to informational influence because the majority change their view based on the information they receive from the minority. So then an example of a minority influence would be the civil rights movement. So the people involved were a minority of the American population, but they continued to show consistency through their message. They drew the attention of the rest of the American population, so they were also aware of the situation, and that led to the majority to think about the situation and realize the unfairness. This led to the snowball effect, where the activists continued to push for change, and eventually the government agreed to make these changes. Eventually, the majority of the population finally accepted the minority's beliefs and views.
Historically, Christians have had a large influence in the world around us. Starting with the Catholic Church, it really took off with that. Though it started with a small remnant of disciples from Jesus' time and grew rapidly over the next couple of centuries. Christians are called to have a effect on others. They're called to share the gospel and disciple others, which has led to the spread of Christianity as much as it has, even though they still remain a minority influence. Throughout the world, there are some countries, including the United States, where historically they have been the majority influence because of the effect that they had. They're called to serve others before themselves and to take care of those who are not, take care of those who society overlooks, and to live a peaceable life, being reliant on no one else. So a takeaway, as Christians, we should strive to make the world more like Christ and to live like Christ and be an example to those who are not Christians, and to help and support those who are not considered important to society because they are important to God. That's all we got. Thanks.